Okay, we had some opening remarks this morning. We had a talk about threats, adversaries, future environments, potential future missions. What we're going to do is, at this point, is launch into 4 briefs that talk about industrial innovation, that talk about industrial and military innovation, and some examples of that, attributes, principles, lessons learned, and things that might port over to the Army. The first one of those is Barry Jaruzelski, and he is a senior partner and global leader of Strategy N's Engineered Products and Services practice. He has 25 plus years serving the automobile, the industrial, and high-tech clients on strategy, cost, and innovation issues. He is the creator and lead author of the award-winning Global Innovation 1000 study, and you're going to hear a lot of the details of that today, which basically looks at how corporations innovate, which ones do well, which ones don't do well, and the reasons why. He is the winner of the Best of Visions Award from the Product Development and Management Association. He is a member of the panel of judges for the Wall Street Journal's annual Technology Innovation Awards. He was named a top 25 consultant by Consulting Magazine in 2013, and he has presented research on the drivers of innovation success to the National Academy of Sciences. Mr. Jaruzelski.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a great honor to be here. It's such an august audience, and I'm glad that I shined my shoes today, given all the competition on that. But thank you. This is going to be a bit of a change of pace from the very fascinating brief that Dr. O'Hanlon gave. I'm going to torture you with data around corporate innovation and what seems to actually make a difference. Strategy, and many of you used to know about Booz Allen and Hamilton. We were the commercial arm of Booz Allen and Hamilton, and we're now separate. We're now part of Price Waterhouse as of earlier this year. And we've spent the last 60 years looking at the drivers of product development and innovation success, going back to the seminal article on product development life cycle in 1950 in the Harvard Business Review. And so I'm actually going to share some of that with you. As a few people noted earlier, there's a lot of different definitions of innovation. You ask 10 people, what's the definition of innovation? You'll get 17 different definitions and answers. One of the things that we always like to note is science does not equal innovation. I mean, science is a key input and a foundation to create innovation, but innovation is about solving problems. Solving customer problems or solving the problems of soldiers in the field in your case. And so what we've been looking at, because surprisingly in the corporate environment, R&D has been a bit of a black box. Of all the functions within a corporate arena, innovation in R&D is the one that was the least managed and the least understood. And what we did is, starting about 10 years ago, launched what we call the Global Innovation 1000 study to really look what is measurable, what makes a difference. Because often we talk to CEOs and CFOs and they'd say, all this money goes in and maybe something comes out and I never can predict what's going to happen or why. And really we wanted to get our handle on unmasking, does money matter? How does it employed? What actually makes a measurable impact on innovation success? And obviously from a corporate perspective, financial performance is the measure of success. Obviously you have different metrics around success, but we were looking at what can we measure that makes a difference. And our work with clients had really made very, very clear that if it was only about how much money you threw at the problem, life would be easy. But what really makes a difference in terms of success and performance? And that's what we've been doing, for the last decade in the form of the Innovation 1000 study. And the key thing about the Innovation 1000 study is we are focused on what happens and what makes a difference for the 1,000 largest public corporations in terms of R&D spend. So it's not about smaller companies. It's not about the nonprofit sector, the government sector. It's about what makes a difference for major multinational corporations in terms of how they invest in R&D and what kind of results they get from that. And this work has gotten a lot of recognition. There's been some awards that we've been honored with over the years. But really, I think most people will agree it's probably the most comprehensive assessment of the relationship between R&D investment and corporate performance. So let's start with a little context. Last year, there was about $1.6 trillion spent around the globe by governments, by academia, and by the private sector. And the 1,000 largest public companies in terms of R&D spend represented about 40% of that. Now, that's actually a declining percentage of the total. They continue to grow in terms of how much they spend, but 10 years ago, that was nearly half of the global total. And government spending and nonprofit spending has been the largest portion. It went from about a third, it's now nearly a half. A lot of that's outside the United States, as you would imagine. And to be in that Innovation 1000 is about a threshold of about $85 million a year in annual R&D spend by a company. The next 1,000, 1001 to 2000, is that next little slice of 3%. So any company that spent about $25 million a year was in that next slice. So really, private sector R&D spend, even though we hear lots about Silicon Valley and startups, it's really about the 1,000 largest companies in terms of the activity. You can argue about how good it is in terms of the results. But those are the companies that spend at least $85 billion, and the largest spender in the world last year was Volkswagen at $13.5 billion of R&D spend. Now, just again, to give it a little closer into your arena, to think about what the aerospace defense industry and the global aerospace defense industry, the U.S. and everyone else around the world that are public companies, spend about $21 billion on R&D, which is about 3 times the entire RDT&E budget of all of the Defense Department. But that RDT&E budget of the Defense Department is about the same as the global software industry's annual R&D spending, the global industrials, the GEs and Siemens of the world. It's about 60% of what the automotive industry spends. And it's maybe a third of what computing and electronics industry spends. So I think this just drives home the point, which I think some people referenced earlier in the day, that most of the activity out there, particularly in high-tech, software, the internet, is happening in the private sector arena, and at scales that are multiples of the entire DoD budget. And though that $21 billion and only about half of that is U.S. aerospace defense contractors, their revenue is the $60 billion that you grace them with in terms of investments for your future capabilities. But even with that, it still pales in comparison to what's happening in the highly engineered and high-tech arena around the globe. So I think it's always important to note that. And probably more importantly is for companies that are focused on defense as opposed to a balance of commercial and defense aerospace activity, the trend is down. Pure defense players are spending as a percent of sales about half of what they were 20 years ago. They used to spend about 4% of sales. Now they spend about 2% of sales. What keeps that industry-wide measure high that we saw in the previous slide was the people who have a mixed business of commercial aerospace activity like the Boeings of the world, or the Airbuses and others, and it's the defense side that actually is getting the modest investment. So if you look at the high-tech, the 5 largest high-tech companies in the United States versus the 5 largest DoD contractors, as a percent of sales, they spend a quarter to a fifth as much of revenue as the suppliers supporting you do. So I think in terms of where's the innovation happening, the scale of the money involved, it's much more in the industrial base than it ever has been before. And that then layers on top of the fact that the pace of change is even faster in some of these other industries. Now, one of the things we're always very interested in is who are the most innovative companies. And every year we survey about 1,000 R&D and innovation executives around the globe, and just simply ask them a very basic question. Who do you think are the 3 most innovative companies on the planet? And the answer has been remarkably consistent. Apple, number 1, probably no big surprise. Google, number 2. Until 2 years ago, people would always say 3M, which is sort of the king of materials and anything that's flat and thin. But other companies have now come up the chain, like Samsung, last couple of years, Tesla. But the thing that we think is very interesting is every year, it may be consistent, there may be new people added, people that drop out in terms of who are the most innovative. They are never the companies that are spending the most money on R&D. We every year look at who are the 20 largest spenders in detail, who are voted the 10 most innovative. Never more than 2 or 3 companies are on both lists. Microsoft, Samsung typically come up on both the top spenders and the most innovative list, but the most the highest spender list is always dominated by auto companies, pharmaceutical companies that never appear on the most innovative list. So I think it's always interesting that the most innovative companies tend to be more modest spenders. If you look at Apple, which is kind of the usual suspect, the poster child for innovativeness, they're number 20 in the computer and electronics industry in terms of total R&D spending. So it isn't about how much money you throw at the problem. You know, we've been finding it's much more what you do with that money in terms of process, in terms of culture, in terms of planning, in terms of portfolio management. And when we've looked at, you know, from a performance point of view, whether you look at it at profit growth, market cap growth, revenue growth, the most innovative companies always outperform, you know, the biggest spenders. And this is, you know, one of the things we've really been focused on for the last decade. And we've now, as the analytical wonks we tend to be, have now tested it over 10,000 different ways using financial data, leading, lagging, looking at profitability, shareholder returns, the growth of profit, the growth of revenue, that there is no statistically significant relationship between how much you spend and how well you do. You know, there's only one exception out of the 10,000 things we've looked at, and that is if you're in the bottom 10% of your industry peer group. You can starve the beast, what we tend to call be too rich or too thin. And if you're in the bottom 10% of your industry competitive set, the people you actually go to market against and fight for customers with, you can starve the enterprise. You can compromise performance. But there is no statistically significant difference between in the middle 80% in R&D investment or in the 90 or 95th percentile. So it's not how much money you throw at the problem. It's not who has the biggest piggy bank. And frankly, this makes intuitive sense. If it was always about the biggest piggy bank wins, no startup in Silicon Valley would ever succeed because the incumbents would always be able to swamp them. And we've now seen chapter and verse, decade in and out, that new people can come to the table, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Teslas, and do amazing things that displace the established players on initially modest amounts of money. So, I mean, I think this is once you get over a minimum threshold, it all comes down to execution. It comes down to talent, it comes down to strategy, it comes down to focus. So what are the things that we've found that actually make measurable difference? And I think important for you guys, it's not that the DoD is ignorant of this. There are many examples over the history of the defense community where very modest budgets, I mean, for the arena we're playing in, obviously doing chewing gumming and doing combat aircraft are different challenges. But if you look at Have Blue and the F-117 program, there was rigorous focus in a fairly unconstrained environment from a bureaucracy point of view to focus on a key set of requirements of a radar-evading aircraft. And everything else was secondary. What is the mission we are trying to accomplish? We're not going to change everything, and we're going to reuse stuff that already works for things that are secondary. SLAM, which is really to create a new land attack missile. Let's use stuff off the shelf. Let's start with a Harpoon. Let's take other componentry off the shelf. And for $70 million, we had a new missile system, which in this arena is very modest amounts of money, but it was what is the mission, what are the tight set of requirements, and let's only fix what needs to be changed to achieve the objective. So requirements management in the commercial arena, in the DoD arena, critical and can drive major improvements at fairly modest budgets. So what have we found makes a difference? The first thing we found, and it's probably the single largest measurable influence, is direct end-user engagement in the planning process. We always talk about it being customer engagement. People often will get a little confused by that, because often your customer is not the end user of what you're doing. Your customer may be, if you're a business, it may be a wholesaler, it may be some general contractor, but this is direct observation of the end user of the product and direct observation. So it's not relying on market research or intermediaries to tell you. It's going out in the field, whether if you're making power tools, it's watching contractors on building sites use power tools. If you're an automotive manufacturer, it is going with families and watching them use a car, because the key here is to surface unarticulated needs. By having understanding of the product, understanding of the user environment, figuring out what makes a difference. Because engineering is all about trade-offs. It's not so much what we're going to put in, but the secret sauce of engineering is what I am going to leave out. If you look at, when Apple was successful with iPod, iMac, iPhone, the first reviews that came out, in the Wall Street Journal or other technical press were usually saying, it's great, it's easy to use, but it doesn't do X, it doesn't do Y. The BlackBerry has these capabilities, the IBM PC has those capabilities. That was the point. They made it a better experience by leaving things out, by being focused on what was the key thing it needed to do and not complicate it by adding things that it really didn't have to do. And so this actually has tremendous, measurable impact. Companies that have the highest levels of direct end-user insight are getting profitability measures 2 and 3x their competitive set by focusing on end-user input, even if they don't, from a business relationship, sell directly to the end user. The second thing, number 3 in terms of our findings, that makes a major impact on performance is managing the portfolio, and is what we call managing an R&D portfolio that's a funnel, not a tunnel. So it's starting a lot of things, allowing things to basically mature a bit, not all the way to the market, but ruthlessly winnowing the herd, allowing things to start, getting through a few cycles, and then killing projects off. And this not only translates to better profitability. You can imagine that, hey, I'm cutting back projects. It actually leads to higher growth because we're always figuring out, we have a system planned around winnowing the herd, that we're always looking what is the highest, best use of the funds we have, the money, but more importantly, the technical talent, because not all engineers and scientists are equal, not all product managers are equal, not all program managers are equal. How do we focus our scarce resources on the highest, best use? But we create a system that is always built on winnowing the herd, that certain things will only get so far. We will document why we stopped so we can take those learnings forward and maybe use them on a future project or program. But also, if the system is based on the fact that 30, 50, pick your number, it'll depend on the environment, things will die, people may come forward and say, this project isn't working. We're going to pull the plug on it. Famous story, when Steve Jobs came back to Apple, one of the first things Steve did was he had every single engineering team, there were about 120 of them, come through the boardroom and give a 30-minute presentation. So in 2 weeks, every single product under development at Apple, hardware or software, did a 30-minute presentation. And on the spot, Steve did one of 3 things. He said, this is great, we need this, what do you need? This is great, but not for us, we can't afford it. This is the stupidest damn thing I ever saw, it's dead. Now, he terminated 50% of all products under development at Apple in 2 weeks. Now, only Steve Jobs could get away with it, both credibility and arrogance. But he didn't fire any engineers. He redeployed them on the things that they were continuing to do because everything was late, everything was under budget, every project was understaffed. But he was making the judgment, we need to do a few things right. And out of that winnowing, somewhat from the seat of the pants, came iMac, which was one of the things that helped save the company. Another thing I think it's important, to highlight is that if you're thinking about global multinational corporations, which is where, I focus my attention, 93% of them execute R&D in countries out beyond their home country. And that R&D from a corporate point of view is not what's happening by Siemens in Germany or happening by Toyota in Japan or happening by a GE in the United States. It is a global network of flows. There's 2/3 as much R&D comes into the U.S. from foreign companies as is money being sent out of the U.S. to R&D sites they run in China, Germany, Israel, or where have you. So it is a complex global network. And this is one of the reasons that's so important. When we did this analysis 6 years ago, China was already the 4th largest location for R&D spending. It's still not remotely that high in terms of Chinese headquartered companies, but in terms of R&D, and a lot of that R&D is European, Japanese, and American companies doing R&D in Chinese locations. So it's important to realize it is a global network with flows going both ways, particularly in the high-tech and automotive arena. And why does that matter? Because there is a very strong relationship between a globalized R&D footprint and performance. Companies that have a larger portion of their R&D outside. 60% or more outside their home country perform better than average. Companies that use at least 10% R&D being executed in low-cost countries perform better than average. But there is a little bit of a proviso around that. It just doesn't need to be outside. A few large sites. So scale in sites makes a difference in terms of how you execute the R&D. Lots of small little locations tends to fragment and cause poor outcomes and poor results. And this is not just about labor arbitrage, getting cheaper engineers in India or China. In some cases, the engineers in certain disciplines are actually more expensive now, particularly in China. What it is getting the best talent wherever it may be in the world. But if you are serving global markets, you need engineers and designers in those markets who actually know what's happening in that country, because consumers in the US, in Europe, are different than consumers in Japan and China. So being, once again, close to the market and having your engineers close. One of my favorite examples, if you look at General Motors, and General Motors is one of the most successful Western auto companies in China, and they have significant design centers in China. If you buy what was called a Buick LeSabre, which is a prestigious brand in China, it's going to look different. The car outside looks the same as the one in the US, but if you get in the car, all the stereo controls are in the back seat. Now, no American car designer would put stereo controls in the back seat of a sedan because Americans drive their own cars. Well, a Buick LeSabre in China usually has a driver, and the owner is in the back seat adjusting the car. And that's that local insight of how you think about the product, what the local needs are, and once again, being close to the end user is key, which is why this is not just about the cost of engineering, it's about being close to the user and the customer. Now, through our work over the last 10 years, we've actually identified 3 fundamentally different innovation strategies, innovation models that companies follow. And being good consultants, we actually have to come up with a cute name for each of these models. But they are very different, and it's important because what you do in terms of capabilities, what you do in terms of strategy, what kind of culture is different by model. The first one is called need seekers, and this is all about being very close to the customer, directly observing the customer, knowing the customer better than he knows himself, being able to surface unarticulated needs. I mean, Apple is the poster child, for this, and being first to market with what you find. About 25% of companies around the globe follow this model. Some well, not so well, but that's sort of the model they're following. Market readers is the classic fast follower. They are waiting for someone else to be the first to market with the idea, and then they rapidly copy it. So think of it as being a giant coiled spring where the company is relying on almost spending as much time tracking its competitors as tracking its customers, and then quickly reacting with a model that's fast response to basically come up with its own version of the same strategy. About 40% of the companies, and well-regarded companies like Samsung and Caterpillar fundamentally follow this model. And the third is tech drivers, which is, in a pejorative way, is kind of the classic kind of throw technology against the wall, see what sticks. It's much more of a technology push kind of model. Now, none of these imply that people ignore their customers, but it's kind of what's the center of mass of orientation. Deep customer insight, competitive insight, and fast follower versus being kind of technology push. Well executed and well aligned with the business strategy, all of these models can be wildly successful. I mean, Apple is a need seeker, Samsung is a market reader, Google is a tech driver. Anyone in the industrial world would love to be as successful as any one of those 3 companies. But the issue is, have they aligned and built the business to be aligned with this strategy? And it makes a big difference because what we found is for the top performers, and this analysis is based on the top 25% performers in each of these models, they emphasize a different set of capabilities that they're going to be the world beater in. You can't be good at anything. You're going to pick your spots of the capabilities you're going to excel at. So in the case of need seekers, it's all around deep end user insight. So how they gather customer needs is what they excel at. And again, you can imagine Apple is very capable at. They're also superb at global product launches, doing a product launch across all regions simultaneously. Why? They're the first to market. So they want to launch the product everywhere because people are going to start copying them, so they want to make sure they're getting that revenue before there's any competition. So being able to do a global launch. Tech drivers, it's all around platform management, managing the technology, having deep tracking ability of competitors and universities, technological capabilities are kind of the areas they excel in. Market readers, it's around cross-functional and resource deployment because it's all around how do I do this fast response. Now, interestingly, in the R&D and innovation arena, there's lots of discussion of the idea of open innovation, where you open up the boundaries of the company to really see what's happening around the world, to basically look at trying to find new ideas from other sources. Need seekers, tech drivers, think open innovation is really important. You'll see it kind of down in the intersection down there. It's something they both try to excel in. Market readers really don't care about open innovation because their open innovation is stealing your idea and copying it. So it's really important. What's my strategy? What's my innovation strategy? And then what are the handful of capabilities I'm going to be better than everyone at? Because I can't be better at everyone at everything. And this really matters because we've spent a lot of time looking at the topic of alignment of the business strategy to the innovation strategy and whether the culture supports it. We found that over a third of companies, there's a complete misalignment between business strategy and innovation strategy. People kind of shake their heads. How can that be? But a well-known telecom equipment company that I won't name, we were working with several years ago, and their strategy was all around growth in emerging markets. And they spent about $150 million a year on R&D. And when we actually looked at the R&D portfolio, there were 3 tenets to their growth strategy, and only 7% of the R&D budget was in any way connected to the growth strategy. And 93% of it was just legacy programs that just kept getting extended and getting extended and getting extended. And no one ever questioned, why the heck are we doing this? It doesn't actually support anything we're trying to do. So this linkage between the innovation strategy, what is innovation doing for us, what is it doing and what it's not doing, and how that supports the business strategy. And then is the culture supportive? And, this sounds a little airy-fairy to some folks, but that 44% in the upper right corner outperform everybody else. There is a strong, very strong relationship. If you get everything right, enterprise strategy, innovation strategy, and the culture highly aligned, you outperform your peer group in revenue growth, in profitability, in total shareholder return. So in the corporate arena, alignment matters. Now, you'd think if we bother to go through strategies, it probably makes sense we're aligned with those strategies. But it's hard to achieve, to get everybody kind of walking in line with the stated strategies and having every functional strategy tightly aligned with it. But we've been able to determine it makes financial difference. And this is also part of the secret sauce in Silicon Valley. We collaborated with the Bay Area Council, which is kind of the equivalent of the Chamber of Commerce of Silicon Valley. And because they were very interested in the topic of culture, what makes Silicon Valley different? And out of that work, we kind of identified 2 things. First, that Silicon Valley companies had a dramatically higher level of business strategy, innovation strategy, and cultural alignment than corporations in general. And that Silicon Valley companies were more likely to be need seekers by almost a 2-to-1 factor than companies around the world. And when we stepped back, because we actually expected them to be tech drivers, but when we thought about it, the venture capital culture of, a tight business plan with a technology plan, launch customers, and a son-of-a-bitch financier that wants to make sure the results are happening, actually deliver results. And actually, that's the essence of a need-seeker model, of getting that business strategy, innovation strategy, and culture aligned. So a lot of the startup culture and the VC financing culture is in this need-seeker model of knowing the user, figuring out what technology needs to apply, and then driving hard against a very tightly defined plan. Now, the other thing we've taken a look at is in running innovation organizations. Whenever we do this survey, we find that about 50% of all companies have reorganized their engineering, product development, innovation in the last 2 years. People are constantly churning these organizations. And everybody seems to think that structure is a big deal, that it's all about org structure. And when we have taken a look at what makes a difference in effectiveness, the most important thing is information flows, access to information. Number two is that people have the decision rights to do something about that information. I think, for folks in the military who think about empowering small units, I think this makes intuitive sense. But motivators, which is consultancies for money, and structure are half as effective as information and decision rights at getting good outcomes out of innovation. Now, when I show this to venture capitalists, they pull out their hair. How can money not be the most important thing? Well, some people, a lot of people, technical people and a lot of other folks in different lines of work respond to things more than money. And frankly, we've actually found that it's only half as effective as a lot of other things. And one of the last couple of things I would say, there's been a lot of talk over the last few years about things like crowdsourcing and using the internet and things. It's probably less so in worlds like the aerospace and defense community. But when we've looked at it, when it really comes to how do we get requirements, what tools and mechanisms do we employ to get a better understanding of what we should do, the tried and true stuff of being close to the customer, observing the user, still trumps all. And I don't think that should be a big surprise. Some of these things, new tools can help, but they can't replace end-user understanding and direct observation. And I think particularly for engineers, to have people in the field observing things is key to actually doing good requirements, because you want it to be visceral and internalized, that they actually can think about the trade-offs by having seen how things are used in the field, that you can't actually capture that level of internalization in any paper document that you ever create. And the one last thing I would leave you with, as I've got 2 seconds here, is the finding from our most recent. And there was a large-scale retrenchment of major corporations during the Great Recession. Now, one thing we found is around the globe that R&D was the least cut function of anything that corporations did. Capital expenditures, SG&A were all reduced double digits. R&D budgets were only cut about 3 to 4% around the globe at the peak of the recession. But what they did was they de-risked all their portfolios. They kept spending about the same amount of money, but they shifted it to lower, surer bets. So rather than swing for the fences for a home, they basically funded lots of single and double kinds of projects because they had a higher chance, I'll at least get some return in a high-risk environment. People are shifting back, and based on research last year, people are cutting their sort of incremental R&D investments, the things that are like minor changes to existing by about a quarter, and they're increasing, major new platforms and breakthroughs by anywhere from a quarter, by 25 to 50, 60%. So companies are shifting to bigger bets, longer term out horizons in terms of investments, and they're willing to take more risks, which I think is good for, in terms of a sense of people's expectations for the environment. They're willing to take more risks and take bigger bets. So with that, before we go to questions, I'll just leave with a few takeaways. It's not about how much money you have. It's much more about end-user insight, a rigorously managed portfolio where you have a planful winnowing of the herd and redeploying of people and money. It's about focus, not only of projects, but which capabilities you're going to excel in and investing those, and then finding the right partner for those. Alignment of strategy, enterprise strategy, innovation strategy, and culture is key. And access to information, decision rights is much more important than how you structure the organization.